Hi, everybody. I didn't get to pick my walk-up music. I'm a little bummed. I was hoping it'd be like Joy and Pain or something like that. I always imagined if I made it to the big leagues, I'd pick that song. Anyway, I'm Sam Huston. I'm a Chief Strategy Officer at iProspect. Before I get started, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody. You know, this is a huge week for all of us. Jeremy said it this morning, but it truly means a lot to have you, and we're really grateful for the time that you've committed to us. I'm also particularly grateful for Jeremy by taking Guy Raz's advice and creating space for me to fail in real time in front of all of you right now. Hopefully this goes well. But seriously, this year I'm really excited about the conference. Our topic of a turning point and the evolution of branded performance, I think, is really, really timely. I'm super excited to be up here and to talk to you a little bit about it. I have a great panel. I can't wait to bring them up, so I'm not just up here by myself. But before I do, I just want to give you a little bit of background on how we're thinking about it and how we're really approaching what we're calling the recoupling of branded performance. As I was working on this, it was really interesting for me to start to see, is this really a problem? Is our branded performance really separate things? And as I started talking to some of our clients, as I looked at the work we were doing at iProspect, and we're starting to see more and more silos created around branded performance. And that makes sense. When we think about the changes in the last 5 years in the media landscape, they're fairly dramatic. We think about the complexity. When I first started working at iProspect in 2013, I think Instagram had about 100 million users. Today, the top 50 influencers on Instagram have 3.1 billion followers. So the amount of complexity and the amount of fragmentation that we're experiencing in the marketplace is pretty dramatic, and it's having a real impact on how we have to go to market and the specialism that's required to do the job really, really well. And we think about data. I think in 2013 there was 12 zettabytes of data. I don't know what a zettabyte is. It sounds like a huge number. I'm sure it is. Now there's 47 zettabytes of data, and it's doubling annually. And just the amount of consumer control that's happened in the marketplace. I think Jeremy did a really great job of illustrating that, and just the amount of control that we have as consumers over the media we consume, and finding ways to integrate marketing into that is a real challenge. And so it forced us to separate branded performance. But the interesting thing to me is that those same forces are what's forcing us to bring it back together. That level of complexity, the amount of data that's available to us and consumer control is really forcing us, despite having different KPIs, despite having different goals, and despite having a lot of times different targets, are forcing us to bring branded performance back together. And the reason for that is because they've created a generation of fully empowered consumers. No more was this better illustrated than what Jeremy's talking about. We have more control over the world around us than we've ever had before, and that's particularly true with the media we consume. And if we're not understanding who these empowered consumers are, then we're not going to be successful as brands. They are truly dictating the way forward for us as brands. And when we think about the empowered consumer, there's a couple things that I think are really important to keep in mind. First and foremost, they have higher expectations for everything that they interact with. We talked a lot about this last year, but those higher expectations aren't just for the product's experiences, but it's for brands themselves. They're not looking at brands just to innovate new products. They're also looking for brands to help set the moral compass for society. And if we're not meeting those expectations as marketers, we're not going to see the sustainable growth that we desire from a performance perspective. They demand value. It's very clear that they understand how much their data is worth, and they expect something in return for that. They know how valuable every dollar they spend is, and they want something back for that. And that could be newer products, but it could be something as simple as making their life a little bit easier, or just helping them save a little bit of time. And as Jeremy said this morning, they want brands to matter. They want brands to play an important part in their life. It's not just about marketing to them. It's about becoming an integrated part of who they are. And that's critical. It's absolutely critical as we think about that. And from a media perspective, one of the most interesting things for me is that they're curating their own journeys. Every journey has a beginning and an end. We just don't know where that beginning is or where it's going to end now. And we've got to make sure that from a media perspective, we're taking advantage of every single touch point and creating those cohesive experiences. They're hyper aware of their data, and they expect value in return. Every year, Dentsu Aegis does a study called the Digital Society Index. This year's study just came out. If you're interested in getting a copy, we're happy to share it with you. It's a really powerful report. One of the things that really stood out to me from that is that 44% of the people surveyed have taken action to limit the amount of data they share with brands. 44%, it's not a huge number, but I think we're seeing substantial change in that area. And next year, I expect it to be much higher than that 40%. And I think it's just a leading indicator of where things are going and how important it is for us to make sure that we're understanding that value equation and that we're giving something in return. And importantly, attention doesn't scale. I think it's important for us as marketers to keep in mind that attention is a finite resource. For a long time, we just thought we could create more and more content and then people would find a way to consume it. We're at a point now where we're at peak attention. We're not getting any more attention available to us. So we have to really take advantage of every single touch point. And that becomes really important as you start to think about the relationship between brand and performance media. Every single touch point has to not only sell the product, but it has to build brand awareness. It has to drive top of mind. And making sure that we're using each of those touch points to its best ability is absolutely critical. So in this environment, the thing that's most important is consistency through the journey. Making sure that we're messaging in the right way, we're aligning with consumer expectations, and we're doing what's needed to help build the businesses that we need to. And that consistency ensures trust. When consumers see a breakdown in messaging, when they go to a landing page and the product that they clicked on isn't reflected, it creates a sense of distrust in consumers. And making sure that we're building that consistency across the entire experience is absolutely critical. And the best way for us to do that is to understand the true identity of people, not relying necessarily on proxies any longer, but really understanding who they are as consumers, allowing what we know about people to start to dictate the context and the connections that we're creating with them, and then building experiences that allow us not only to build brand, but also to sell products or fill hotel rooms. And so in this context, that separation of brand and performance really doesn't align with the needs of consumers. We have to find a way to start to bring it back together, a way to start to get people to work together in different ways, despite having different budgets, despite all the momentum behind keeping them separate and all the specialism that's required at every touch point to start to bring them together. So that's what we're going to explore with the panel today. I'm really excited to welcome my panel guests, and I'm going to ask them a few questions to see how they handle it and how they're dealing with this challenge in their own way. If you guys wouldn't mind coming up, that would be great. Before we start, just again, thanks again. I can't tell you how grateful I am to have you all up here and how fun it was for me to get to spend some time with each of you as we explore this topic a little bit further. But before we get started, if you could all just to introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
Sure thing. I'm Stephanie Sladek. I work with Adtalem Global Education.
Steve Wellman, Director of E-commerce for Wolverine Worldwide.
David Gallon, I'm Head of Global Digital Marketing for Tory Burch.
So I'm just curious, first and foremost, do you guys see this as an issue? Have you experienced it? And if you could each tell me a little bit in your own way how you're handling the managing brand and performance, either separately or together.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'd actually maybe articulate it more as the opportunity. And so at Wolverine Worldwide, we do have brand marketing teams and we do have e-commerce or performance marketing teams. I think the experience and just how we maximize that opportunity is a combination of a few things, right? When we plan, it's really collaboratively with iProspect and our brand marketing teams, and we look at all the things across the top funnel, across the mid funnel, across the bottom funnel, and I'll fully admit that I think the vast majority of the people in this room actually, when I say like the funnel, they're like, that doesn't really exist anymore, and that's not, which yeah. I definitely agree with too. I think it is, as far as a best practice, it actually is a pretty helpful communications tool for us in our business when we work collaboratively, just because it provides a strong kind of communication framework that we can look at. But everything from looking at our budgets to what tactics we're investing in, along with the different audience strategies in our creative to kind of maximize that consumer experience. So I think that's how we try to maximize that at Wolverine.
David, what about you? How are you? You have a unique perspective at Tory.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're in a slightly different situation where we have, we've brought it all sort of together under one roof in the last couple of years. As a luxury brand, it's really important to control everything about the user experience,
Absolutely.
right? We obviously have goals, and we want to be able to drive our business in the same way that everybody does. But part of a brand like ours is creating desire, and we've curated a very specific lifestyle. And so the combination of sort of brand and performance is something we talk about a lot. And that sort of move to combine both halves back together when they had lived separately for quite a while, I think was a really important step for us, right? And if you think about it, it's how if you were starting today, you would do it, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of like a vestige from the past, like that we've all sort of organized into our little silos, right, in terms of branding and performance. But any startup today would not do that, right? And so how do you take the more modern approach to it? It's really important.
Absolutely. Stephanie, you kind of have a unique experience in building it from the ground up. And so as you're doing that, how has that changed, or what have you learned in the process of starting almost with performance first?
Yes. So we had historically been a performance-driven organization, and only recently have we found the value in investing more in our brand marketing strategy. I think one of the key challenges is that we have been trained or conditioned to think about assigning every dollar a ROAS.
Right.
And that it is easy to slide into that when it comes to your brand marketing. So that's one of the key challenges that we face, and are really working to drive a culture shift around the way we think about each kind of marketing.
I think that raises a really interesting question around KPIs. So how are you handling KPIs? Are you aligned internally, or are you keeping them separate, or have you changed what you're looking at from a KPI perspective?
Yeah, so we have our tried and true KPIs that were tied to our performance media, and those remain. One of the ways that we think about brand marketing is how it can lift some of our performance KPIs, but then we do have separate KPIs that we've created when it comes to amplifying the brand and helping people understand what we stand for. I think that part of our message had been not totally clear in the past, and it's something that we're focusing on driving now. Yeah.
David, have you seen, from a KPI perspective, have you seen that when you invest in brand, you're seeing a lift from a performance perspective?
Yeah, I think the conscious coupling of the two back together, I think, is really interesting because, people who are very well versed in performance media, which is basically all of us in this room, understand KPIs and like empirical evidence that things work, right? It's very clear and easy to see, and it's easy to optimize against that. And I think when you look at branding media, part of the approach you have to take is to say, actually, there are measurables, right? I mean, there are definite things in awareness and consideration that are empirical, that you can measure against. I think lift is a really, really important one, right? And there are ways to study this and understand the impact and influence that it has later down the funnel, right, for your brand. So, I think the second thing we've done in our sort of unified brand and performance marketing approach is to say we need to look at a lot of KPIs, right? Frankly, right? And so I think it's been evolving the conversation past just ROAS, right? It's certainly a very important critical metric for us, right? Yeah. And certainly we look at that, and it's what drives a lot of our decision making. But the story is actually sort of bigger and broader than that, right? And so, all the way through the funnel from sort of awareness, consideration, conversion, and retention, we really look across all kinds of different KPIs to try to understand and put together a more holistic view of what's happening. And it is all measurable, but it means having a lengthy sort of detailed discussion about it all.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm just kind of curious about, I know we didn't talk about this, but it came up when we were having dinner last night, Steve, is that what we often look at, we start from the top and we look down. And so we'll say, if we invest in brand, it's going to impact our ROAS this way. But I'm curious if any of you have looked at, the impact that performance media might have on brand and doing the same. It's a little bit harder to test, but I'm just curious if anyone has looked at that.
Yeah, and I can jump in and say I think that's definitely where we want to go, and I think that we all consciously as marketers know that, right? We're to David's point around, we're trying to raise awareness, we're trying to look at all the different KPIs and drive revenue and ROAS for the business in total, but the opportunity there is, I think, doing both, talking about how brand lifts the performance, but to your point too on performance lifting brand is we know that when we send prospecting ads or when all the impressions we're putting in the marketplace, all the traffic that we're driving to our websites is definitely helping build the brands in the same way that we want to when we look at it in the inverse. So I don't think we've cracked the nut fully, but I plan to make that our big goal, one of them.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the performance media is the way in which it can drive awareness and be one of the first touch points for a branded experience. I think that we have seen that in our performance marketing side, and it is important to be there when the consumer's looking for you. It provides a certain utility, but I think there's also the importance of a more brand-centric or experience-driven experience that you want to convey at the same time. So that goes to show you, the importance of having both.
And I think I totally agree, and I think part of what internally, right, inside the teams and organizations you have to do is sort of like tear down those walls and labels, right? I mean, even us now, we're talking about it like brand versus performance, but the approach really today is to take it holistically, right? There is no branding and there is no performance. It's actually all the same, right? Yes. And each is accomplishing objectives for the other, and it all works together. And look at the ad formats. Look at something like YouTube for intent, right? I mean, this is a branding play traditionally, but it can drive serious amounts of traffic and conversion, right? So is that branding or is that performance?
Yeah.
So has it changed the way that you set budgets? I know that's a controversial question. If you can't answer it, that's still okay.
For us, it has. I think it has. I think YouTube, the way it can sort of cross both worlds, and same with social media, has really changed the way we invest. And I think we see channels like that can do the heavy lifting in both as a more effective play, and I think we've reallocated accordingly.
And I think sorry to jump in, I was going to say in support of those total business goals, right? Like we look and we build the marketing mix and the media mix in total, and we basically want to build it up in such a way, to your point, where we're kind of checking the box on all the KPIs. Okay, we want to lift brand awareness by this. We want to raise product consideration by that. We want to drive this much revenue and traffic to an e-commerce business. So when we look at the whole media mix, we can certainly adapt and alter and kind of change the budgets and the mix and where you put stuff in what channels and how much you put in YouTube, how much you don't. But essentially looking at all those goals and then developing a cohesive plan across our entire organization that sets out to achieve all those goals collectively.
So, do you find that similar in your organization, David? Is it a similar process for you? And how is that impacted from a time perspective? One of the things that we all feel is that the immediacy and the amount of time that we need is short. And sometimes when you have these longer protracted conversations, it gets a little bit longer.
I never have those conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, everything as it becomes more complex, each new thing you layer on, right, adds another level of complexity, right? And so our approach to this has been to really lay out a very clear journey model, right, for everyone's experience with the brand from a digital perspective, right? To say, it's a tool that allows us to have conversations cross-functionally within the organization, right, which is part of how you're going to drive sort of the budget and creative conversation with your partners, right? And so when you have something that everyone understands and is aligned to, that's sort of in plain English for folks who aren't, fluent in knee-deep in the day-to-day of things, that's been really helpful and instrumental for us to have those conversations from a planning perspective.
And are there things tactically you're doing to help speed that up, like briefing teams holistically or at the same time? Or, Stephanie, do you have anything from that perspective that you've?
Sure, yes. So one of the things that we've done is brought the iProspect team into the office and had them join some of our internal meetings with our stakeholders so that they could help gain some of the deeper context and some of the business objectives we're trying to achieve. And I think that level of alignment and that context has really been helpful in speeding up the process. It didn't replace a really good brief, but I think the context is really useful so that we're all grounded in the same page.
And what from our side can we be doing better? Is there anything from an agency perspective that we can work on to make this more seamless?
Yeah, I'd say to our earlier point about looking at the top funnel, how it's how brand grows our performance media and how performance media lifts brands. I think certainly within Wolverine Worldwide, the thing that we need iProspect to do more of is to help bridge the gap, help both let us know when we have kind of the brand and performance media, like what conversations do we always need to be in together, planning, strategic, quarterly QBRs, a lot of the briefing process, a lot of the stuff that we do collaboratively, and then in your weekly and daily optimizations where you can kind of optimize to the KPIs. So I think for certainly for agencies and you guys, the way to help is to both bridge that gap, but then bring it a little bit more to life with us, and then be able to use all the data and facts to bridge the gap and tell all that.
And what about media owners? What role do they play in this, if any?
I mean, I think they're good partners in all this, and certainly need to both be able to specialize and be masters of their own domains, but then also understand how it plays collaboratively across the entire media mix, because that's the place where those partners shine the best, is when they know and they can consciously make the decision to say, well, yeah, we've got our stuff that we do here, but we know that when you do it coupled with these other elements, it brings that 1 + 1 = 3 concept.
I think partially it's about broadening the conversation, and we need to find a way to sort of talk about the experience, right? Like we talk a lot, as everyone does, about sort of the art and science of all of this, right? And I think there's a human element to the fusion of sort of branding and performance that can't be overlooked, right? And so I think from an agency perspective, because we like results, right? Because we want ROAS, right? We're all sort of driven and held accountable to this. I think that's our first instinct, is to sort of go there. And I think you can't really discount the human element, where you have to understand the impact it has on the experience of your brand from a consumer's perspective. Does it actually make sense, right? There's 100,000 marketing technologies, right? There's a technology solution. There's someone out there doing anything you want to do, right? But you can't let the commerce get ahead of the art, right? To make sure that you're protecting the integrity of customers' experience with your brand. And I think agencies, have to help brands understand the implications for what they want to do, right? On the whole bigger picture, right? Because in isolation at the granular level, in terms of execution, that's great, right? And that works really, really well. It's when you zoom out to the bigger picture and have to line all these things up against to create a cohesive sort of experience of your brand, that's really complicated. And I think we need to find a way to have a better framework to talk about things like that.
Absolutely. I mean, particularly with a luxury brand, that maintaining that sense of perceived scarcity and that specialness is really important. And sometimes if you go too far down a performance model, you sacrifice some of that. So how have you unlocked that?
I actually think it's okay to have a performance model, even as a luxury brand. This I think is totally fine to do. This is our approach, right? I mean, we have a performance model. It started there before it was really focused on brand, and so it's the lion's share of what we still do today. But I do think it's about the consumer's expectations, particularly in luxury, right? It's more acute there, but certainly. There's all kinds of AI-driven technology that's going to allow, you're going to allow sort of the predictive intelligence to say what people are going to want, right? So for a brand, that's based on a very curated lifestyle, right. Sometimes those things are in conflict with each other, right? And so you need to find, again, it's the human element, right? The technology can do it, but how do you put the right guardrails around the technology to make sure that you preserve, right, for the integrity of sort of your brand message? Yeah. And again, that's not really a branding thing or a performance thing. It's really applicable to both.
Mm-hmm. And how else has technology influenced? It's really interesting that you're starting to rely on AI technology to manage some of that performance-ness of it. Where else are you using technology, and what role is that playing in this process?
I mean, I think for us, it's the tricky part, I think, is managing the bigger picture, like the holistic presence of it, right? Because you've got all these sort of platform-specific technologies, right? If you look at, dynamic on Facebook versus, dynamic how you might be doing behavioral retargeting through display. When you look at even outside of media, right, how you're suggesting, products and trying to cross-sell and upsell on your website, right? You have all these different engines powering sort of unique experiences, and it's really the question of how do you try to bring those things together so that there's cohesion across it, right? Because the customer doesn't know it's powered by AI. They're not thinking about this. To them, it's your brand making a recommendation to them. And if you're making 3 different kinds of recommendations across 3 different, outputs of your brands, it's not a great experience.
Right.
So Stephanie, for you, it's a little bit, you have a different challenge in that you're getting people to apply it. It's a huge life moment for them. So how are you looking at performance, and what role does brand play in that process?
Sure, absolutely. When it comes to education, that brand becomes part of your identity. It goes on your diploma, it goes on your resume. So I think we have to be really mindful of the way it's presented. And I think we have a responsibility to show what this brand stands for throughout that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, for you, the balance between, still a large percentage of your business is wholesale, and a smaller percentage is direct. And where does do you see a role for brand as more of driving wholesale, or is it vice versa?
I think it's all of the above. I mean, a lot of times we look at the value that both our e-commerce business provides in business KPI terms, but also how it enhances and how it encompasses the entire consumer experience for all of our brands, and using it as the pinnacle expression of the brand. So then if you think about it like that, we articulate it and we think about it in many different ways, where you've got, okay, well, you have your e-commerce business, but also how many people come to our e-commerce business and then actually shop wholesale or go into a store. Yeah. I don't actually know what the number is, but I wish I did. I'm sure it's actually a really large number of the halo of just what the digital experience and e-commerce experience is to the consumer. But in addition, it's a balance of the back and forth there.
So we've talked a lot about the consumer, and what we've seen a lot of times is there's a delta between that brand consumer and the performance consumer, and that makes sense. You want to make sure that you have that aspirational target that you're always talking to. But how important is attribution?
Oh, it's paramount. It's like
the most important thing.
Somewhere up there. It's in the top.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter at all to us.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I think from an attribution perspective, we've kind of seen some ebb and flows in the quality of the data that we're able to get back, and I think as performance marketers, we tend to rely on it fairly heavily. But I'm curious, from a brand perspective, does it have that same level of impact?
I think about it in the context of what you talked about, David, which is understanding the journey. And I think we owe it to our consumers to better understand that journey, and that comes through attribution. And in years past, it hasn't always been, the perfect science, but we get closer and closer. And the nuggets of information that we get out of it are so incredibly valuable, and I think really lead to key or important changes in the way we think about the way we deliver the media.
So, everyone's talking about data and that proliferation of data. How important is that? And are you struggling through it, or is it becoming a sort of an easy thing for you to handle as a brand?
I tend to think of data in the same way we think about technology. Like, it's just this foundational element that powers everything we do. So data in regards to our first-party consumer data that we can use to do lookalike targeting, and we can use for reactivation. In addition, the different data sets that we can share across partners. So again, like the M1 tool, and then using it to come full circle around optimization and how we manipulate the budgets and how we react to various business needs throughout the year. Because I think we can all do a really good job creating these really robust, really sophisticated plans that kind of check all those KPIs that we want to for the year. But then in the middle of running our businesses, right, everybody knows that we're reacting, and we have various KPIs that kind of bounce back and forth, and then we need to make adjustments and react accordingly for what's best for the business.
Yeah.
And where do you draw the line from a KPI perspective? If we want to take a traditional funnel look at it, and upper funnel is more about brand, how do you define the middle of the funnel?
For us, I think...
Is that a hard question?
It's a great question.
I don't think it's a hard
Someone tell me
question.
the answer.
one of the ways that I've personally articulated is within kind of the mid-funnel, I kind of break it in half. I have kind of the upper half of the mid-funnel and the lower half of the mid-funnel. Knowing that we're raising product consideration, we're driving traffic, and we're driving revenue to our business through our mid-funnel efforts, it's kind of, so we know that from a higher upper funnel, a kind of upper mid, more awareness, you're focusing on things like impressions and reach and awareness and brand awareness lift and driving product consideration and driving traffic to the website. But then we certainly have a bunch of different tactics that we specifically set out with the mid-funnel that have ROAS goals. There's certainly, the ROAS goal is not as high as stuff that's in the bottom of the funnel, but it certainly leverages more of that kind of like lifetime value model to.
So you're setting ROAS goals based on the different levels of where they are. So you might have a 4 at the bottom of the funnel and a 3 at the middle of the funnel.
Yep.
Is that the same for you?
Yeah, we took a similar approach to this, right? And this year we actually started looking at sort of that consideration, that mid-funnel piece a little bit differently. Whereas traditionally we had sort of put it into the conversion sort of retargeting bucket, and we really separated out sort of that mid and lower funnel, and it's yielded some really interesting results for us, right? And I think illustrated where there's white space, there's clear opportunity for us to increase the scale in some of those things. And I think it surprised us, frankly, a little bit how profitable that mid-funnel piece was, right? Because we didn't have as granular a view of it when it was sort of a bigger portion, right, of what we sort of would consider retargeting in our business and model. And so it's been super interesting, and I think it's again adding more complexity, but the further you break out, right, to your point, the stages of the funnel, the more granularity in your view, the more optimization, the more leverage you have, and the more opportunities, to sort of increase impact at each of those places become more apparent this way.
That's crazy. I mean, it's crazy. Like the amount of complexity is pretty crazy, and pushing further into that level of complexity is somewhat mind-blowing. So what are you doing internally to prepare the organization for that? I mean, like I'm not ready for that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that, knowing that we're marketers and grappling with this role of brand and performance. I think about some of our internal stakeholders, decision makers, and one of the things that I think we can all do better is help educate them on these particular topics as we talk about budget allocation and goals and KPIs, really understanding how this art and science come together to accomplish all of those.
Is there still an art? So I've been doing media for a long time. We'll just say that. And I think when I first started, there was probably a little bit more art than there is now. And so I'm curious, where do you see the art still coming into play?
Yeah.
I think there's a tremendous amount of art in it. I really do, right? And I would make the distinction between, a lot of people are like art means the creative, right? It means you should shoot your product on gray backgrounds instead of white, right? Like I don't even mean this, right? This to me is like a separate thing, but I think the art is really in your approach, right? And I think it's about interpreting what the data is telling you, right? It's the analysis of all of that informs your approach about how you're going to put together this model, right? We all operate pretty complex media mixes, right? And so I think there is a really, really integral component of it, which is the human element to really go through it and be able to say, all right, so the numbers clearly empirically say this, but what does that mean, right? And how do I interpret what the numbers say, and how do I action that, right, to improve upon the empirical portion? So I think the art and science balance is really, really important.
Yeah, I think as we talk about journeys, the science is the journey, step by step by step, right? But the art is the experience.
Yeah.
And so as we talk about this distinction between the two, it's that art that makes people say, wow, as opposed to their basic expectation in the digital age.
So despite everything, it's still human-to-human communication, and it's still that emotion that's going to bring us all back together and drive the results. I think that's incredibly fascinating to me, and I think, do you guys have examples of where that has driven increased performance?
I think we have. When I look, and we talked earlier about storytelling, and we've kind of heard a little bit about that. So then to bring in that art element and to be able to tell that story, to create that emotional connection with your brand and to compel consumers to sign up for email and buy from your website, it's a sequence journey where we have seen with our brand campaigns, to some of your points about brand lifting performance. And when we can tell that story and create that compelling experience with the consumer, that's where we see the lift.
I think it's also, right, I mean, just an example from our world, we have a pretty complex system for our sort of behavioral triggers on our website, right? So with audience overlap and exclusions and segmentation, that's the science, right? So these are all sort of scientific building blocks, right? That are like very clear, right? You can create this audience and you include this one from this one, right? This is science, right? It's basic, it's building blocks. The art of it is different though. It tells you, what should I be doing, right? And so if I've been to this section of the site, what is the science, right, can get me there on the people I want to reach, but how do I create the best experience that meets the customer's desires and adds value to their journey and relationship with a brand based on their behavior, right? And it's really complex, but the art and the science are both necessary components of it.
Does one trump the other? Is there a time when the science is going to trump the art where because we have these conversations all the time where you make a recommendation and you can say, we're going to drive this level of return on ad spend, or we're going to see some level of performance, but it's just not right? Or is there time, does the science always win? Someone once told me nothing ends an argument like data. Is that still true?
I think, I think it depends on your brand, right, and what your values are, and what your goals and objectives are. I think for a brand like ours, the art is paramount. It's really critical to the vision, of Tori and what she's created, and she's a very real person who has a very real point of view, and so I think we want to be true to that. And so for a brand like ours, I think the art is really critical. It doesn't mean we can't invest in performance.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we can't drive
Absolutely.
all of that, but there are times when the art wins. Absolutely.
Yeah. Is that the same for you, Stephanie? Like it's a sort of a different, it's a different approach from an education perspective.
Right. I answer the question like a true performance marketer, which is, well, what's your goal? I think, we at Adtalem are a turning point in a way because we are really trying to define who we are and what we believe in and what we stand for. So in many regards, that becomes more important because that's going to be what sustains us longer term.
And so, that holistic experience, how important is that? Have you seen when you haven't had that holistic experience and the impact it's had on performance? And what is the takeaway that you've seen from consumers without that creating that holistic and seamless experience?
Yeah, I think it builds a sense of distrust.
Yeah.
I think that particularly when it comes to, one, the empowered user, but two, the broader social network of an individual, those moments of distrust are amplified greatly. So I think we have to be really careful and really mindful in the way that we deliver those customer experiences, particularly knowing that we're talking about asking for the opportunity to take them through a really important experience in their life, which sometimes exceeds 2 or 3 years. Yeah. So I think being mindful of that experience at the get-go is important.
Have you seen the same thing?
Definitely. I mean, it's personal, right? We're inviting people into our home, right? And I really like that metaphor because I think that's how we like to think about it, right? And so it is extremely personal, right? And so that experience every consumer has with our brand, we want it to be seamless and effective, but we want it to feel right? It should be meeting people's expectations, when they come inside.
And are you thinking about that experience when you're setting budgets and when you're forecasting levels of performance, or are those two things still sitting separately?
I would say they'd be together. So, right, when we set those budgets, when we employ the tactics, when we say, okay, let's lay out a season, let's lay out a year for what this brand, what's our goals, what stories are we trying to tell, what's our target consumer, what's the imagery and assets and creative that we're using, right? Like that all gets baked into how we think about our budgets and how we think about what resources we have, what we can utilize, where we can be flexible, where we have lots of assets and abilities for choice, and where we might be taking a bigger leap into a new channel or a new ad format. We might not have as much stuff, specifically shot for that, but we definitely can take some tests and try to evolve that customer journey a little bit more.
So, what questions haven't I asked?
Can we talk about the tech stack?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know that both Steve and I have had recent experiences and trying to consolidate the number of platforms we've been using when it comes to our MarTech. One of the things that we've spent the last 18 months doing is reducing our tech cloud, I'm going to call it cloud because it's not a stack, from about 30 platforms down to a single stack of 7 products, which has given us the ability to integrate and allow data to flow throughout the entire thing and really do what we need to do the right way. I know that was something you're further along than I am.
Yeah, and we, when we look at that whole stack, right, we're thinking foundationally. It really starts from our attribution framework, and then we kind of build from there, right? So like make sure the data layer and what we can capture via our attribution solution is there, and then we can kind of add and build to it. So then when you think about all your different technology components about how you do your audience targeting or how you do your creative expression and how we, one thing that we're working pretty intently on this year is to bring that personalization aspect more into both our ad creative and the site experience. So if we're saying, we know that customers come through this part of the site, this target audience comes through this part of the site to achieve this goal, right? Then we can, and maybe it kind of throws back a little bit to the journey process where if you can use your entire technology stack, and a lot of times, and we've tried to think very consciously about, and everybody in this room knows that there's a ton of technology options out there, and there are some that natively integrate with one another, and there's some that you would invest millions of dollars integrating your entire stack with all these different solutions. And so for us, it's being pretty particular and precise about where we think in the future, when we look 3-5 years out, what can natively connect and how can we get this to all seamlessly talk to one another so that we can expedite this entire consumer experience and this aspect of personalization. I mean, that's how we've approached the technology stack, but it powers everything from reporting to our audience strategy, again, to creative.
And personalization is a really interesting topic, and I think personalization across the journey is really, really important, and that's what's going to sort of start to bring branded performance even closer together. From a luxury perspective, how important is personalization, and how are you approaching it now?
Yeah, we talk about it a lot. I mean, certainly it's very true to the DNA of a luxury brand or most sort of retail brands that own apparel or accessories, right? And if you think about an in-store experience, right, you have clienteling and associates who are really, really educated, right, to know their customers and make recommendations and call or email them when there's a new arrival they might be interested in. So there's a very personal, very one-to-one, very personalized approach in stores. And so how do you think about replicating that on a massive scale digitally and applying that to sort of your site experience? And there are some really, really interesting, innovative technologies. I think, I think for feed-based programs, there are sort of new and interesting things that are happening in sort of visual recognition of your product catalog and assigning attributes beyond what you could do with just sort of regular text tagging. And so I think there are some new and interesting products that are coming out that are going to help enable, from a fashion and luxury perspective, some of powering some of that, where certainly we can't curate 70 million different, right, unique experiences, right? And so there has to be an automation, there has to be a technology-fueled solution to it. It's just a matter of, again, not letting that technology get ahead of the art for us.
And how are you managing through the value exchange? In order to create personalization, you're asking for consumers to share a lot of data. Is it enough? Is a personalized ad enough to create that sense of value? Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is my personal sort of impression of it, I think people are generally, at least in the US, fairly, they understand sort of how it works, right? I mean, we're all sort of complicit in it, and certainly I think there's people who are digitally savvy on their devices, and 1 in 5 people only works on their mobile device, right? They don't even have a computer or a laptop or anything, right? And so I think people are generally sort of accepting of that handshake if the brand delivers on a curated and relevant personalized experience, right? If we're able to sort of take that data and that information at the individual level, right, and add value to the consumer with that information, I think most people accept that that's a good exchange. Absolutely.
And I think you mentioned specifically the ad creative, and I think if you looked at just the ad creative, right, we'd sell the consumer short on the entire experience. But if we can have the ad creative speak to the right landing page and curate the correct product and bring the kind of the merger of content and commerce together. So if we can create that story alongside that product, then that's really where I think we start to build that trust with consumers and start to build that extra luxury point of view or that added value for the consumer that's gonna make them, one, want to pay full price for the products that we make. In addition, keep them coming back, right? So that's the retention play is something that we haven't really talked a lot about here, but I think the whole retention aspect of how we can create that experience, get those consumers coming back and know what they want to come back for, and then be able to, personalize the whole retention strategy is even, a continued evolution of the entire journey path.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place for us to end. I just want to thank you guys again. It's been really great. I'm really grateful for your time up here, and thank all of you. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.